Just a few weeks ago, solidarity between Egyptian youth and Wisconsin police officers, or between Libyan workers and Ohio public employees, yes, it might have elicited a raised eyebrow, but that is what's happening right now. Let's go back to Tunisia, where it all began, or partly. You know what happened before the uprising in Egypt. The uprising in Tunisia was sparked by the suicide of a young man. He was 26, his name is Mohamed Bouazizi. He had just graduated from university, couldn't find a job, no options, goes to sell fruit and vegetables in the marketplace, buys a little scale. And the authorities start harassing him and they confiscate his scale. And in utter frustration, he sets himself on fire. He saw no future for himself and he immolates himself. That was the spark that ignited the Tunisian uprising, that became a wildfire that has raged across the Middle East. And there was something else that sparked it: WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks, the whistleblower website that has served as a platform to release information about war, among other things, right? They released the Iraq war logs. They released the Afghanistan war logs. These are tens of thousands of documents. Now, this is very important because the US media, much more than other media in the rest of the world dealing with this, focuses on the personalities behind WikiLeaks, like Julian Assange. That would be relevant if he wrote the war logs. You know, if he was the author of them. You want to know who he is, should we trust him, all of that. If he wrote the US government cables in the last release of documents, but he didn't write any of those. He has simply established a website that provides a forum for these to be released, a deep believer in transparency. So these last trove of documents, the US government cables, the biggest release of government cables in history, were very significant. You know, right before the uprising, Hillary Clinton, the Secretary of State, did her tour through the Middle East, what some call her apology tour, to these despots for what came out in those documents. And we should look more closely at the places she went. But in Tunisia, the documents that were written by US government officials, diplomats, talked about Ben Ali being a brutal, corrupt dictator. And it just confirmed what Tunisians already knew. And then, of course, asking them why is the US government shoring him up. But it was just, you know, the final documentation of his massive corruption. So you put these together and the Tunisian uprising is ignited. And that led to Egypt as well. So you have these uprisings. For decades in the region, people have lived under dictatorships, many that receive US military aid, suffering human rights abuses, along with low income or no income, high unemployment, almost no freedom of speech, all this while the elites massed fortunes. Similar grievances underlie the conflicts in Wisconsin and Ohio. The Great Recession of 2008, according to economist Dean Baker, now in its 37th month with no sign of relenting. In a recent paper, Baker wrote, due to the financial crisis, many political figures have argued the need to drastically reduce the generosity of public sector pensions and possibly to default on pension obligations already incurred. Most of the pension shortfall is attributed to the plunge in the stock market of 2007-2009, he writes. In other words, Wall Street hucksters selling the complex mortgage-backed securities that provoke the collapse are the ones who caused any pension shortfall. The Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist David K. Johnston, who wrote for the New York Times for years, now writes at Tax.com, came on Democracy Now! And said the average Wisconsin state employee gets $24,500 a year. That's not a very big pension. 15% of the money going into it each year is being paid out to Wall Street to manage the money. That's a really huge, high percentage to pay out to Wall Street to manage the money. So, while investment bankers skim a huge percentage off pension funds, it's the workers who are being demonized and asked to make the sacrifices. Those who cause the problem, who then get lavish bailouts and now are treated to huge salaries and bonuses, are not being held accountable. Following the money, it turns out that Governor Walker's campaign was funded by, well, the Koch brothers. I told you we'd get to it. Major backers of the Tea Party organizations, and I dare say that the Koch brothers would hardly have tea with the people they are supporting. They also gave $1 million to the Republican Governors Association, as did Rupert Murdoch, which in turn gave substantial support to Walker's campaign. Is it surprising that Walker supports corporations with tax breaks and has launched a massive attack on unionized public sector